Hello.
I'm Steve, 35 years old, and for the longest time, I thought my life was on track. Married to Kathy for 8 years, I worked long hours to provide for us and to save for the family we were planning. I thought we were a team. She stayed home most of the time since her job as a freelance designer gave her flexibility. She was the one who handled the social side of our lives, while I focused on building our future. It felt like a fair division of roles, or so I believed. The first sign something was wrong was subtle, small changes in her behavior. Kathy had always been affectionate and playful. But over the past few months, her energy shifted. She started spending more time on her phone, laughing at messages I wasn't privy to. When I asked about it, she'd brush it off as work stuff or group chats with her friends. The jokes used to be shared, but now it felt like she was shutting me out. I tried not to overthink it. Life was busy, and we all get caught up in our own world sometimes, right? It was little things piling up that I couldn't ignore. Kathy started going out more often, girls' nights, client meetings, errands that took longer than they should. She'd come back energized, flushed even, and if I asked, her answers felt rehearsed. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was working late nights at the firm, barely spending quality time with her, and I thought maybe this distance was my fault. So, I doubled down on trying to make things work. I planned date nights, bought her small gifts, and even started leaving work earlier a couple of times a week. She seemed to appreciate the effort, but it didn't feel genuine. I couldn't put my finger on it until a friend of mine, Greg, dropped an unexpected bomb. Greg's the kind of guy who's always looking out for me. We've been friends since college, and while we don't talk every day, we always have each other's backs. He called me one evening, out of the blue. "Steve, I don't want to upset you, but I think you need to know something," Greg started, his voice unusually serious. "I was at that new bistro downtown last week, and I saw Kathy there." "Oh yeah," I replied, confused. "Was she with her friends?" "She wasn't with friends," he hesitated. "She was with some guy. They were close." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. I laughed it off at first. "Come on, Greg. Kathy has clients, you know that. Maybe it was a work thing." "Steve, it didn't look like work," Greg pressed. I didn't want to assume, but they were holding hands across the table. "I thought you'd want to know." I wanted to yell to tell Greg he was wrong, but his tone was too sincere. It wasn't like Greg to stir up drama without reason. That night, I confronted Kathy in the gentlest way I could. I ran into Greg the other day. I started casually, watching her reaction. "Oh? How is he?" she asked, too nonchalantly. "He mentioned seeing you at that bistro downtown. Who were you with?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Her face froze for a split second before she smiled. "Oh, that was Alex from work. We were brainstorming ideas for his new campaign." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But something in the way she quickly dismissed it left a sour taste in my mouth. Still, I let it go. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe Greg had just seen it wrong. But deep down, I felt the first crack in the foundation of our marriage. After that night, I couldn't shake the conversation with Greg or Kathy's reaction. It wasn't like me to be suspicious. I'd always trusted Kathy, but something felt off. I told myself to stop dwelling on it, but the seed was already planted. Kathy's behavior became more erratic. She started dressing up more often, even on days when she said she was just running errands. She started guarding her phone like it held state secrets, taking it with her to the bathroom or flipping it screen side down whenever I walked into the room. "Why so secretive lately?" I joked one morning as she practically snatched her phone off the counter when I walked in. "It's nothing," she said, laughing nervously. "I just don't want you to see my shopping cart before Christmas." It was November. Christmas was still weeks away, but I nodded and let it go. That's what I did. I let things slide because I didn't want to believe my own doubts. I didn't want to believe that Kathy, the woman I'd built my life around, could be hiding something from me. But Greg's words kept replaying in my head. Who was Alex, really? She'd never mentioned him before. Why hadn't I seen him at any of her work events? My gut told me to ask more questions, but every time I thought about it, I backed off. I didn't want to come off as the controlling, paranoid husband. One night, we were sitting on the couch. I was watching TV while she scrolled through her phone, her face lit up by the screen. Every so often, she'd chuckle or smile at something, but when I asked what was so funny, she just waved me off. "It's nothing," she said. Just a stupid meme Alex sent. There it was again. Alex. I tried to sound casual. You two seem pretty close. You talk about him a lot. Kathy glanced at me, her face unreadable. He's a funny guy, that's all. You'd like him if you met him. Maybe I should, I said, watching her reaction. She hesitated, just for a second before replying, yeah maybe. He's really busy though. Big projects and all. Her words felt rehearsed, like she'd been waiting for me to ask. That hesitation, that split second of discomfort, was all it took to send my mind spiraling. I didn't say anything else, but I started to wonder if I was living with someone who had become a stranger to me. That night, while Kathy was asleep, I couldn't help myself. I crept downstairs, grabbed her phone from where she'd left it charging, and tried to unlock it. My heart was pounding, guilt clawing at me even as my fingers hovered over the screen. But the phone was password protected, and she'd changed her code. She never used to have a lock on her phone. The next morning, I tried to push the thought of it out of my head. I threw myself into work, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. I felt like I was walking on eggshells, questioning everything she said, everything she did. I hated feeling that way, but I couldn't stop. Then came the moment that changed everything. A few days later, Kathy was in the shower when her phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up with a message. I miss you too. Can't wait until Friday. Alex. My stomach dropped. I stared at Kathy's phone, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out every other sound. I miss you too. Can't wait until Friday. Those words etched themselves into my brain. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was like the world shifted, and I was standing on unsteady ground. What was Friday? What was she planning? Kathy's voice from the bathroom snapped me back to reality. She was singing, carefree, oblivious to the storm brewing just outside the door. I put the phone down, careful not to touch it again. I didn't want her to know I'd seen the message. Not yet. I needed answers. At work that day, I couldn't focus. I kept replaying everything in my head, piecing together all the odd moments I'd brushed off. The late nights, the guarded phone, her evasive answers. It was like seeing a puzzle come together, and realizing the picture was nothing like what you'd expected. I called Greg during my lunch break. Hey man, you got a minute? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Of course. What's up? Greg sounded concerned right away. Remember what you told me about seeing Kathy with that guy? Alex. I hesitated, then took a deep breath. You were right. There's something going on. I saw a text from him on her phone. Greg cursed under his breath. Steve, I'm sorry man. What are you going to do? I don't know yet, I admitted. I need proof before I confront her. She's too good at talking her way out of things. I need something concrete. There was a pause before Greg spoke again. You ever thought about hiring someone? A private investigator. The thought hadn't crossed my mind, but as soon as he said it, I couldn't shake the idea. A private investigator. Someone who could find out the truth without Kathy even knowing. It felt extreme, but so did the situation. Do you know anyone? I asked quietly. I know a guy, Greg said. He helped my cousin a few years back. I'll send you his info. That evening, Kathy was as cheerful as ever. She kissed me when I came home, asked about my day, and made small talk over dinner. It was so normal, so routine, that it made me question myself. Was I reading too much into things? Was I being paranoid? But then I remembered the text. I miss you too. Can't wait until Friday. I didn't bring it up. Instead, I made an excuse about having to work late the next night. I wanted to see if she'd jump at the opportunity to leave the house. Sure enough, her eyes lit up. Oh, that's fine, she said casually. I might go out with some friends then. Which friends? I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She hesitated. Just the girls. You don't know them. They're from that design meetup I joined a while back. Her answer sounded rehearsed. Too smooth. Have fun, I said, forcing a smile. Inside, my stomach churned. The next day, I called the private investigator Greg recommended. His name was Mark, and he got straight to the point. Tell me what you know, Mark said, his voice calm but professional. I told him everything, about Kathy, the changes in her behavior, the text from Alex. I felt like I was spilling my guts to a stranger, but Mark listened without judgment. "I'll need a few details," he said when I finished. "Her schedule, her usual hangouts, and anything you know about this Alex guy. I'll handle the rest." By the time I hung up, I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. Relief that I might finally get answers. Guilt that I was going behind Kathy's back. But I told myself it was necessary. If I was wrong, I'd know, and we could work on rebuilding trust. If I was right, I didn't want to think about that yet. Friday came quickly. I pretended to leave for work, but instead, I parked a few blocks away and waited. Around 7 p.m., Kathy left the house. She was dressed to the nines, hair done, makeup flawless, wearing a dress I hadn't seen before. My chest tightened as I watched her get into an Uber. I texted Mark to let him know she was on the move. He replied almost instantly, "Got it. I'll keep you updated." I spent the rest of the night pacing the house, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Around midnight, Mark called. "She met with a man at a hotel downtown," he said bluntly. "They had dinner at the hotel restaurant, then went up to a room together. I've got photos and a video of them entering the room." My stomach dropped. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "Anything else?" I managed to ask. "Not yet," Mark said. "I'll follow up in the morning." "But Steve..." "I'm sorry." I hung up without saying much. Sitting alone in the dark, I felt like my whole world had just shattered. The next morning, Mark sent over the evidence. Photos of Kathy laughing with Alex at dinner, leaning into him in a way that was too intimate for just friends. Then the final blow, a video of them entering the hotel room together. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours. There was no denying it anymore. Kathy wasn't just distant or secretive, she was betraying me. My hands shook as I turned off my phone. She came home that morning like nothing had happened, smiling and humming as she made coffee. Watching her act so normal, I felt sick. I couldn't bring myself to say anything, not yet. Instead, I stayed quiet and planned my next move. I couldn't confront her until I was ready, until I knew exactly how I wanted this to end. By the evening, I'd made my decision. I would confront her. But I wasn't just going to ask for an explanation. I was going to show her the proof. I wanted her to see that I knew everything. I just had to wait for the right moment. The moment came that evening. Kathy was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. I walked into the living room, my heart pounding, and sat across from her. "Kathy, we need to talk," I said, keeping my voice steady. She looked up, her expression shifting from calm to slightly wary. "Sure, what's up?" "I need you to be honest with me." "Who's Alex?" I asked, watching her closely. Her reaction was immediate, a flicker of surprise, followed by a forced laugh. "I told you, he's just a coworker. Why are you asking about him again?" I reached for my phone, pulling up the photos and video Mark had sent me. Without saying a word, I placed it on the table in front of her and hit play. Her face went pale as the video showed her and Alex entering the hotel room. For a moment, she just stared at the screen, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for words. "Steve, I can explain," she stammered, her voice shaking. "Explain what?" I snapped, my frustration finally spilling over. "That you've been lying to me? Sneaking around behind my back? Go ahead, Kathy. Explain." Tears filled her eyes as she started babbling excuses. It wasn't what it looked like. It was just dinner. I wasn't thinking straight. It was a mistake. "Stop lying," I interrupted, my voice cold. "I have a private investigator, Kathy. I know everything." She broke down, sobbing into her hands. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Steve. I swear. I was just so lonely, and you've been working so much. I didn't feel like you noticed me anymore." Her words cut deep, but I didn't let it show. "So your solution was to cheat? To throw away everything we've built? You think that justifies what you've done?" Kathy fell to her knees, clutching my hands desperately. "Please, Steve, I'll do anything. Just don't leave me. We can fix this." But as I looked down at her, I realized I didn't believe her. How could I? She'd shattered my trust, and there was no going back. "I need time to think," I said, standing up and pulling away from her grasp. "I'll stay in the guest room tonight." She begged me to stay, but I walked away, leaving her crying on the floor. As I closed the door behind me, I felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time in weeks, I knew what I needed to do next. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Kathy moving around the kitchen. She was trying to act normal, but I wasn't ready for her forced cheerfulness. I avoided her, grabbing my coffee and heading to my office. I needed space. By mid-afternoon, I got a call from Mark, the investigator. "Steve, I found something else you need to know," he said, his tone serious. "What is it?" I asked, bracing myself. It turns out Alex wasn't just some guy she happened to connect with. "Someone orchestrated this," Mark said. "There's another player here, a woman named Linda." Ring a bell. Linda. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. She was my coworker, someone I'd been friendly with over the years. Linda always seemed a little too interested in my personal life, but I'd chalked it up to her being nosy. "She set this up?" I asked, stunned. "Yes. She paid Alex to pursue Kathy. I haven't pieced together her motive yet, but it looks like she's been planning this for months." Mark's words left me reeling. Why would Linda do this? It made no sense, until it did. I remembered the little comments Linda used to make at work. Compliments about how stable I was, how she envied Kathy for having a husband like me. I'd brushed it off as harmless chatter, but now I realized it had been something more. "She's obsessed with me," I muttered, mostly to myself. "Looks like it," Mark replied. "What do you want to do with this information?" I didn't have an answer. Kathy's betrayal was one thing, but learning that someone had manipulated her, manipulated us, added another layer of complexity. After the call, I sat in silence, trying to process everything. Linda had sabotaged my marriage for her own selfish reasons, but Kathy had made the choice to cheat. Both of them had betrayed me in different ways, and I wasn't sure who I was angrier with. That evening, I confronted Kathy again. This time, I told her everything Mark had uncovered. At first, she looked confused, then horrified as the pieces clicked together. "Linda? Your co-worker? Why would she do that?" Kathy asked, her voice trembling. "She wanted me for herself," I said bluntly. "And you fell for it." Kathy started crying again, but this time, it didn't move me. "I didn't know, Steve. I swear I didn't know." "You didn't want to know," I shot back. "You let yourself be swept away because it was easier than facing whatever you felt was wrong with our marriage." She tried to reach for my hand, but I stepped back. "Steve, please. You have to believe me. I was stupid, but I didn't mean to hurt you. I love you." I shook my head. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this." For the second night in a row, I left her crying. But this time, there was no hesitation in my mind. Kathy wasn't the person I thought she was, and I couldn't see a way forward anymore. The days that followed were a blur. Kathy tried everything to win me back: apologies, promises, tears. But her words felt hollow. I couldn't look at her without seeing those photos, without hearing the excuses she'd made. What hurt most wasn't just her betrayal, but the choices she made over and over again. She hadn't come to me when she felt lonely. She'd gone to Alex. And while Linda's manipulation was sickening, it didn't erase Kathy's role in this. I reached a breaking point that Friday. I left work early and went straight to a lawyer's office. I'd spent enough time thinking about it. There was no fixing this. Sitting in that office, going over the details of our life together, our home, our savings, our plans for a family, was surreal. Kathy and I had built so much together, and now I was tearing it all apart. The lawyer was calm and professional, explaining the process and what to expect. "Do you think she'll contest this?" he asked. I shook my head. "I don't know. She's desperate to stay, but there's no way I can trust her again." When I got home, Kathy was waiting for me in the living room. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red, her hair disheveled. For a second, I felt a pang of sympathy, but it quickly faded. "I know where you were," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "Then you know what's coming," I replied, setting the papers on the coffee table. Her face crumpled as she reached for the folder, flipping through the pages. "Divorce? Steve, no. We can work this out. Please, we can go to counseling, whatever you want." "Counseling won't fix this," I said, my voice steady. "It won't erase what you did, Kathy. It won't make me forget." She fell to her knees, clutching the papers to her chest. "I'll do anything. I'll cut contact with Alex. I'll never talk to Linda again. I'll quit my job if that's what it takes." "It's not about them anymore," I said, shaking my head. It's about us. And there's nothing left, Kathy. Not for me. I walked away as she sobbed, locking myself in the guest room. As I sat on the bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt a strange sense of relief. The decision was made. I was taking control of my life again, even if it meant walking away from the life I thought I'd have. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept without waking up in the middle of the night. It wasn't peace, but it was a start. The day I moved out was colder than I expected for November. Kathy sat on the couch, watching silently as I packed a few essentials into a duffel bag. I told her I'd be back later to sort through the rest, but for now, I needed space. You don't have to do this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I paused, looking at her for what felt like the 100th time in the past week. Each time, the hurt in her eyes made me question myself. But only for a moment. I do, I replied, zipping up the bag. We both know this can't go back to how it was. She stood up, tears already falling. But we can try, Steve. We can fix this. I'll do anything, just tell me what you need from me. I should have felt something, anger, pity, maybe even a shred of hope. But I didn't. I was empty. I needed you to be honest, Kathy. I needed you to choose me before it came to this. Her knees buckled as she sobbed into her hands, and for a second, I almost went to her. But I stopped myself. She'd made her choices. This was mine. I grabbed my bag and walked out without looking back. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. It was nothing special, a one-bedroom with outdated carpeting and a faint smell of fresh paint. But it was mine. As I unpacked, I kept expecting to feel the weight of everything crashing down on me. The finality of leaving my home, my wife, the life I thought we were building together. But instead I felt lighter. Over the next few days, I focused on work and tried to settle into a routine. I kept my phone on silent most of the time. Kathy called constantly, leaving messages that swung wildly between apologies, anger, and desperation. Please, Steve, I'm sorry. Just talk to me. We can figure this out. I can't believe you'd throw everything away like this. You're being cruel. Steve. I don't know how to do this without you. Please don't leave me. I listened to every message once, then deleted it. I couldn't bring myself to block her, but I didn't reply. One night, I sat on the couch, staring at my phone. I thought about calling Greg, asking if I was doing the right thing. But I already knew the answer. There was no undoing this. Instead, I opened a beer and scrolled through apartment listings, thinking about what came next. For the first time in weeks, I felt the faintest flicker of hope. Not for what I was leaving behind, but for the life I could rebuild. It wouldn't be easy, but at least now, it would be honest. A week passed, and I was beginning to settle into the strange quiet of my new life. My days were filled with work and unpacking, while my nights were mostly spent staring at the ceiling, wondering what it would take to feel normal again. That Saturday, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. It wasn't much, just a few blocks of older apartment buildings, a convenience store, and a small park. I stopped at a bench, watching a group of kids play tag, their laughter cutting through the crisp air. For a moment, I let myself imagine a different version of my life, the one where Kathy and I had the family we'd planned for. But that version was gone. When I got back to the apartment, Kathy was sitting on the steps outside the building. She looked tired, her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail, her makeup smudged like she'd been crying. "What are you doing here?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "I had to see you," she said, standing up. "You won't answer my calls. You won't talk to me." I didn't know what else to do. I sighed, unlocking the door and holding it open for her. 5 minutes, Kathy. That's all I can give you." She followed me upstairs, clutching a folder against her chest like it was the only thing holding her together. Once inside, she sat on the edge of my couch, looking around the room like she couldn't believe this was where I'd ended up. "This is nice," she said softly, though we both knew it wasn't. I sat across from her, waiting. "What do you want, Kathy?" She placed the folder on the coffee table, sliding it toward me. "These are all the messages from Alex. Everything he ever sent me. I wanted you to see that I've blocked him. He's out of my life for good." I stared at the folder but didn't reach for it. "You think this changes anything?" Her voice broke as she replied. "I don't know. I wanted to show you that I'm trying. That I'm serious about making this right. I leaned back, running a hand through my hair. Making this right? Kathy, you don't get it. Blocking Alex doesn't undo what you did. It doesn't erase the lies or the betrayal. She started crying again, but this time, I didn't feel the same pull to comfort her. I know, she whispered. I know I can't fix this. But Steve, I love you. I still love you. And I don't want to lose you. I shook my head, standing up. You already lost me, Kathy. The moment you chose him over me, you lost me. Her sobs grew louder, but I couldn't bring myself to care. She'd made her choice, and now I was making mine. As she stood to leave, she turned back one last time. If you change your mind, I'll be waiting, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't reply. I just closed the door behind her and leaned against it, staring at the floor. Part of me wanted to scream, to break something, to let out all the anger I'd been holding inside. But instead, I walked to the window and watched her drive away. For the first time, I realized she was no longer a part of my life. And that realization brought a strange, bittersweet peace. The following Monday, I returned to work, determined to push forward. But every time I saw Linda's face in the office, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I couldn't just let her get away with what she'd done. By lunch, I'd made up my mind. I waited until Linda stepped into the break room alone, then followed her in. She smiled when she saw me, her usual over-friendly demeanor on full display. Hey Steve. How's it going? She asked, grabbing her coffee mug. I didn't bother with pleasantries. We need to talk, I said, my voice low but firm. Linda hesitated, her smile faltering. Sure. What's on your mind? I stepped closer, keeping my tone controlled. I know what you did, Linda. I know you hired Alex to go after Kathy. Her face froze, the color draining from her cheeks. For a moment, she tried to recover, forcing a laugh. What are you talking about? That's crazy. Don't lie to me, I snapped, my voice sharp enough to make her flinch. I have proof. You've been manipulating my life for months, and I want to know why. Linda's composure cracked. She set her coffee down and crossed her arms, avoiding my gaze. Fine. You want the truth? Yes, I hired Alex. But it's not what you think. I scoffed. Not what I think. You paid someone to seduce my wife, Linda. What could possibly justify that? She looked up at me, her eyes filled with something between guilt and defiance. I was trying to protect you, Steve. Don't you see? Kathy didn't deserve you. I wanted you to see that. Her words hit me like a slap. Protect me? You destroyed my marriage. I didn't destroy anything, Linda shot back, her voice rising. She did that all on her own. All I did was speed up the inevitable. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The sheer audacity of her logic left me stunned. You had no right, I finally said, my voice trembling with anger. I care about you, Steve, Linda said, stepping closer. I've always cared about you. And I couldn't stand to see you wasting your life on someone who didn't value you. I stared at her, disgusted. You think this is love? Manipulating my wife, my life. None of this was for me. This was all about you. Her expression faltered, but she didn't back down. Maybe it was. But you can't deny that Kathy showed her true colors. If it wasn't Alex, it would have been someone else eventually. I shook my head, my hands clenching into fists. You don't get it, do you? It's not your job to decide who's right for me. What you did was cruel, selfish, and unforgivable. Linda reached out as if to touch my arm, but I stepped back. Steve, please. Stay away from me, I said coldly. From now on, we're just co-workers. Nothing more. She opened her mouth to argue, but I didn't give her the chance. I walked out of the break room, leaving her standing there alone. As I returned to my desk, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Confronting Linda hadn't fixed anything, but it had given me closure. I couldn't control what she'd done, but I could control how I moved forward. And moving forward meant cutting people like Linda out of my life for good. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork and meetings with my lawyer. Kathy had initially begged me to reconsider, but after realizing I wasn't going to change my mind, she stopped fighting and agreed to an uncontested divorce. I thought it would make things easier, but sitting across from her in the lawyer's office for the final review of the agreement was anything but. She looked fragile, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands trembling as she signed each page. "This doesn't have to be the end, Steve," she said softly, not looking up. "It already is," I replied, my tone neutral. Her shoulders slumped, and she nodded, letting out a shaky breath. "I never wanted this. You have to believe me." I didn't respond. What was there to say? I'd believed her once, and it had led me here. The last signature felt like closing a chapter of my life I never wanted to end. When the lawyer announced everything was finalized, Kathy broke down in tears. I stood up, forcing myself to keep my composure. "Goodbye, Kathy," I said, my voice quieter than I expected. She looked up at me, her face wet with tears. "Goodbye, Steve." That night, I packed up the last of my things from the house. Kathy wasn't home. She'd agreed to give me space to collect my belongings. The house felt cold and empty without her, without the memories we'd built together. As I walked through each room, I caught glimpses of the life we'd shared, the photos we'd taken, the plans we'd made, the laughter we used to fill these walls with. And for a moment, I felt the weight of everything I was leaving behind. But then I reminded myself of why I was doing this. Trust was the foundation of any relationship, and Kathy had broken ours in a way that couldn't be repaired. Before leaving, I placed my key on the kitchen counter, along with a short note. "Kathy, I hope you find the happiness you're looking for. Goodbye. Steve." Back at my apartment, I poured myself a drink and sat on the couch, staring out the window. For the first time since everything had unraveled, I allowed myself to grieve, not just for the marriage, but for the future I thought I'd have. It wasn't fair. I'd done everything I could to build a stable life for us, and it still wasn't enough. But I knew I couldn't dwell on that forever. This was my chance to start over, to rebuild my life on my own terms. And while the path ahead felt uncertain, it also felt full of possibility. I finished my drink, set the glass down, and made a promise to myself. No matter how hard it was, I wouldn't let this define me. This was the beginning of something new. The first few weeks after the divorce were a strange mix of freedom and loneliness. Some days, I felt like I was finally breathing again, free from the tension that had suffocated me for months. Other days, the silence in my apartment was deafening. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects to keep my mind busy. My coworkers noticed the change, but I avoided their questions. The last thing I wanted was to become office gossip. Linda, thankfully, stayed out of my way. She barely looked at me during meetings, and I didn't go out of my way to acknowledge her. One evening, Greg called and insisted I meet him for drinks. "You've been holed up long enough," he said. "Come out and join the land of the living." I hesitated, but eventually agreed. A few hours later, I found myself at a dimly lit bar, nursing a beer while Greg rattled on about his latest project. "You're too quiet," he said suddenly, pointing his bottle at me. "What's going on in that head of yours?" "Just adjusting," I admitted. "It's weird, starting over." Greg nodded, leaning back in his chair. "It'll get easier. Trust me. You're better off now." I wanted to believe him. As the night wore on, I noticed a woman sitting at the bar, glancing in our direction. She had a warm smile and an easy laugh, and something about her caught my attention. Greg noticed too. "Go talk to her," he said, nudging me. I shook my head. "It's too soon." "It's just a conversation," Greg replied. "You're not marrying her. Come on, Steve. You need to get back out there." I hesitated but eventually made my way over, feeling more nervous than I expected. "Hi," I said, offering a small smile. "I'm Steve." She smiled back. "Nice to meet you, Steve. I'm Rachel." We chatted for a while, and to my surprise, it felt easy. She wasn't pushy or overly interested in my past. She just seemed like someone who enjoyed a good conversation. When I returned to the table, Greg grinned. "See? That wasn't so bad." I laughed, shaking my head. "Maybe you're right." That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Rachel. I wasn't ready to start something new, but talking to her reminded me that there was life beyond Kathy. It was a small step, but it was something. Over the next few weeks, I focused on building a new routine. I started going to the gym, picked up an old hobby, photography, and even volunteered at a local shelter on weekends. Each day felt like a step forward, even if it was just a small one. I wasn't healed, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving in the right direction. Just as I started finding my footing, Kathy re-entered my life, or at least tried to. It began with a text. "Kathy, Hi Steve. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I need to talk to you. Please. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. I don't think there's anything left to say, Kathy. We've both moved on. Her response came quickly. Kathy, I know you don't owe me anything, but I'm struggling. I can't stop thinking about everything. Can we meet? Just once? A part of me wanted to ignore her. But another part, the part that had spent years caring about her, felt a flicker of sympathy. Maybe she needed closure. Or maybe I needed it too. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her. We met at a small coffee shop across town. She looked thinner than I remembered, her eyes hollow and tired. The sight stirred something in me, not love, but a faint sadness for what we'd lost. Thanks for meeting me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She fidgeted with her coffee cup, her hands shaking. I've been going to therapy, she began. Trying to understand why I did what I did. It's helped, but I can't stop feeling like I ruined everything. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. You did, Kathy. You ruined us. But I'm not here to rehash that. Why did you want to meet? She looked down, tears pooling in her eyes. I needed to say I'm sorry. Not just for what I did, but for the way I blamed you. None of this was your fault, Steve. It was mine. Her words caught me off guard. I'd waited so long to hear her take responsibility, but now that she was, it didn't feel as satisfying as I thought it would. I appreciate that, I said finally. But an apology doesn't change what happened. I know, she said quickly. I wanted you to know that I see it now. How selfish I was. How much I hurt you. We sat in silence for a moment before she spoke again. Do you think you'll ever forgive me? She asked, her voice trembling. I considered her question carefully. Maybe someday, I said honestly. But forgiveness doesn't mean we go back to what we were. I've moved on, Kathy. You need to do the same. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'm trying. I really am. For the first time in months, I felt a small weight lift from my chest. This wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't even closure. But it was a step toward letting go of the anger I'd been holding on to. As we left the coffee shop, Kathy hesitated. I hope you find happiness, Steve. You deserve it. You too, I said, and I meant it. Walking away, I felt lighter than I had in months. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain: my future didn't include Kathy. And for the first time, I was okay with that. After meeting with Kathy, I felt like a chapter had truly closed. I wasn't sure if it was forgiveness or just the act of finally hearing her admit her faults, but something shifted. The anger I'd been carrying around felt a little less heavy. In the weeks that followed, I kept focusing on myself. The photography hobby turned into something more serious, and I started taking weekend trips to capture landscapes and cityscapes. It was the first time in years that I'd done something purely for myself, and it felt good. One weekend, during a sunrise shoot at a nearby park, I ran into Rachel, the woman I'd met at the bar weeks earlier. She was walking her dog, a floppy-eared golden retriever that seemed more interested in chasing squirrels than staying on the trail. Steve, she said, surprised. Rachel, I replied, smiling. Small world. She gestured toward the camera slung around my neck. I didn't peg you as the artsy type. I laughed. It's a new thing. Keeps me out of trouble. We ended up walking together for a while, her dog bounding ahead of us. The conversation was easy, just like it had been the first time we talked. She asked about my photography, and I learned that she worked as a vet tech. There was something calming about her energy, no pressure, no judgment, just genuine curiosity. At the end of the walk, she smiled and said, "Let me know if you ever need a model for one of your shoots. I'm great at standing still." I chuckled. I'll keep that in mind. Before parting ways, I asked if she wanted to grab coffee sometime. She agreed, and we exchanged numbers. Our coffee date a few days later was simple and light. We talked about work, hobbies, and our favorite movies. I didn't tell her much about my past, just that I'd recently gone through a divorce. She didn't pry, which I appreciated. As the evening wore on, I realized I hadn't thought about Kathy once. For months, she'd been a constant presence in my mind, whether through anger, sadness, or regret. But sitting across from Rachel, laughing over her story about a mischievous Labrador, it was like Kathy had finally taken a back seat. When we said goodbye, Rachel hesitated. I had a really nice time, she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Me too, I replied. Maybe we can do this again? Her smile widened. I'd like that. As I drove home that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not just for a relationship, but for the possibility of a life beyond the pain and betrayal I'd endured. I wasn't rushing into anything. I was still rebuilding myself, piece by piece. But for the first time, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something to look forward to. Rachel wasn't a cure for my broken heart. No one could be. But she was a reminder that life goes on, and that happiness doesn't have to be tied to the past. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to smile, not out of obligation, but because I finally felt like I was going to be okay. The days turned into weeks, and life started to settle into a rhythm again. I wasn't completely healed. There were still moments when I felt the sting of Kathy's betrayal, when the memories crept in uninvited. But those moments came less often, and they didn't consume me like they used to. Rachel and I started seeing each other more regularly. It wasn't serious. Neither of us was in a rush to define things, but it was nice. Easy. We'd grab coffee, go for walks, or watch a movie at her place. She was understanding about my hesitations and never pushed for more than I was ready to give. One evening, we were sitting on her couch, her dog sprawled out at our feet, when she asked a question that caught me off guard. "Do you ever think about what you do differently?" she asked, looking at me carefully. I paused, thinking. "With Kathy, you mean?" She nodded but didn't press me to answer. I leaned back, letting out a slow breath. "Yeah, I think about it sometimes. I wonder if I missed the signs, if I could have done something to stop it before it got so bad. But the more I think about it, the more I realize, it wasn't just me. She made choices, and those choices weren't my fault." Rachel nodded, a soft smile on her face. "That's a healthy way to look at it. Sometimes, people just aren't meant to stay in our lives, no matter how much we want them to." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For months, I'd been carrying the weight of what happened, blaming myself for not being enough, for not holding things together. But hearing her say it so plainly, it felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. "You're pretty wise," I said, smiling at her. "I try," she replied with a laugh, nudging me playfully. One Saturday, I visited the park alone with my camera, determined to capture the perfect sunrise shot. As I stood there, watching the sky change from deep purple to fiery orange, I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. This was my life now, one where I didn't have to constantly question myself or someone else's loyalty. One where I could focus on my own happiness, on finding joy in the small things. For so long, I'd let Kathy's betrayal define me. But standing there, watching the sun rise on a new day, I realized something. I wasn't the man who'd been betrayed anymore. I was the man who'd survived it. Later that evening, Rachel and I went out to dinner. As we laughed over shared appetizers and traded stories, I felt something I hadn't expected: peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from forgetting the past, but the kind that comes from accepting it. From knowing that, while life hadn't turned out the way I'd planned, it had given me a second chance to build something better. As we left the restaurant, Rachel slipped her hand into mine, and I didn't pull away. "Steve," she said softly, stopping under the glow of a street lamp. "Yeah. I'm glad we met," she said, smiling up at me. I smiled back, feeling the warmth of her words settle deep in my chest. "Me too, Rachel. Me too." For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't just surviving. I was living. And I was ready for whatever came next.
Bye.